Welcome to the Quantum Healing Oracle. This is a channel dedicated to using astrology and tarot to bring forward guidance and reflections that can help you live your most empowered and inspired life. My name's Pan. If you enjoy my content, please feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps these videos be seen by more people who may have use for this kind of information. So today we're going to take a look at the astrology. Today is Monday, March 9th. And the first part of this video, I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the astrology that's coming over the next 5 or 6 weeks. And then we'll take a look at the chart and we'll look a little more specifically at the transits that have been occurring and that are occurring right now. So please only take what resonates. These are my interpretations of the energies. Nothing's ever set in stone. And there's multiple paths available to you at all times. It's up to you to choose the path that works best for you. If you'd like a personal reading from me, you'll find my contact information in the description box. So, when looking at the astrology coming up, I want to first briefly discuss why we chart the beginning, what we call the beginning of the astrological wheel at the 0 degree of Aries, sometimes called the world point. And what I feel is the most useful and important understanding of astrology is how it reflects not only how consciousness works, but how we understand ourselves as our consciousness changes. Because I've come to find that all changes, whether they be internal or external, are actually just changes in our own consciousness. So really, when we use astrology, we're studying these changes that we're observing in our consciousness. And by its own nature, consciousness is relational. You have to have a self or an understanding of a self so that you can reflect back the understanding of another. You can't actually understand yourself as something separate or individuated unless you have the reflection of something other. So the nature of the relationship or the relational dynamic between how you understand yourself and how you reflect with the other is the foundation, I feel, for how consciousness develops and shifts and changes and how we learn and grow. And so when I talk about consciousness relating with itself, it isn't necessarily another person. Of course, we all do relate with other people, but it's sometimes the way we relate with money, or the way we relate with our emotions, or the way we relate with our home or our work. And so this is why the astrological wheel has all these different segments and sections. And it shows the different areas in our life in which consciousness relates. And I see the symbolic and cyclical nature of consciousness being almost like nesting dolls, one cycle and pattern inside of another. And it forms like a relationship with a fractal. And no matter how far in you go or how far out you go, you're seeing the same design, but you're zooming into specific patterns or zooming out into specific patterns. And what I mean by that is if you look at the cycles of even when you wake up in the morning, and you relate with your home and maybe your family, and then you begin to move through your day, you leave the home and you engage the outside world, and you come home and you come back into rest and recuperation until eventually you go to sleep. And by the time you go to sleep, you kind of even forget entirely who you are when you go into the dream world. And when you wake up the next morning, you begin a new cycle. And so we see that cycle occurring in every day. And similarly, when you live an entire lifetime, you create a character or an idea of who you're going to be in a lifetime. And that lifetime has an arc of exploration and a way of understanding and growing and relating until it eventually comes to rest. And that's what we call death, or passing back into the higher dimensions, in which case then we create a new character, a new identity, and come back in through the process of reincarnation. So that's an example of how these cycles within consciousness are happening at various different levels. And so when I look at the astrological chart, I see the astrological chart as the representation of that same process of cycles. That in Aries, where we begin the astrology, that's the individuation. That's where you form an identity. and you have a specific relationship with yourself. And as it moves through the astrological chart and through the wheel, it moves through different areas of the life, like home and family, or the way you relate with partners and partnerships, the way that you relate with your service in the world or your groups of friends, until eventually you reach the end of the zodiac wheel in Pisces, where it goes into this dissolution mode, where your identity begins to dissolve and release back into oneness, very much in the same way as we go to sleep at night, and our ego, or our human identity, releases into the dream state, where we're not focused in the same way as that identity. And so this point between the end of Pisces and the beginning of Aries is why they call it the world point, because this is the point where, after that dissolution process, or that reunification with oneness in a way, Aries begins the process of individuation again, where you take on a new identity, you take on a new sense of self, and you begin another cycle of exploration. And so I see astrology as being not only showing how we individually are going through this cycle, but collectively. That's why when we talk and we share about the astrology, we talk about this is the astrology for the entire human collective, because we're all going through certain aspects of this process of cyclical change, and we can chart that change by the way that the planets are aligning, and how that reflects back to us the change in ourselves individually, and therefore the change in the collective. And so this time has been really powerful, focusing on that world point, on that transition between Pisces and Aries, because I see that Neptune and Saturn have been traveling through Pisces. They have been going through that process of dissolution themselves. Neptune has been going through it for 14 or 15 years, and Saturn has been going through that area for the last year and a half. And so if you're familiar with my channel, I see the outer planets as being the structures of the collective consciousness, whereas the inner planets represent more of our individual expression of our unique human consciousness. And how we understand the relationship between the collective structures and our unique expressions is another relational dynamic of understanding how we connect and bring ourselves and connect fully with the collective. And so what I see has been happening is that Saturn and Neptune have been slowly coming into this conjunction and crossing this world point and entering this point of individuation, this beginning point of creating a new identity. And if you want more information on that, you can check out my series on the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I'll put a link in the description box. And so essentially we've been aligning with this new beginning. And this also lines up with the idea, if you're familiar with numerology, that this is a 1 year. This is a beginning of a new 9-year cycle. And so the 1 is always the beginning of a new cycle. So we have the 1-year cycle initiating. We know it's the year of the fire horse, which is understanding our relationship with power and freedom. And as the astrology crosses this world point, it's showing us we're building a new collective and personal identity in the world. The entire human collective is redefining its identity, and we ourselves have the opportunity to define our identity in a new way as well. And so what we've seen happen is those outer planets have come into conjunction in Aries first, which is, again, the structure of our consciousness is changing, and so we're all relating with that in our own way. And all the personal planets, Venus and Mars and Mercury, have been moving along with the Sun, and they're all now currently moving through Pisces. So I see this as the collective consciousness has already begun and initiated that new identity, that new beginning, but our personal planets, our relationship with our unique sense of self, is still going through that process of dissolution at the end of Pisces. And so as each of those planets is moving through Pisces, they will cross the world point and they'll conjunct that same beginning of Aries where Saturn and Neptune are. And I just see this time as a very powerful new beginning for ourselves individually and collectively, if we are tuned into ourselves and we can consciously understand what is beginning and understand how much power we have to choose our new beginning and begin to take authorship over our life. But in order to do that, we kind of have to let certain parts of our personality and our ego and our conditioned programming to be dissolved back into oneness so that we can initiate a new identity and begin to take a new role in the new cycle as we move forward. So I definitely see this as a time of reconstruction. There's a strong emphasis on understanding where to place boundaries, where to take action, where to be willing to step into something new, and the direction in which we choose to be stepping. And so that's kind of the broad overview of what's happening over the next 6 weeks, is that we just had Venus cross that Saturn-Neptune point into Aries, and now we're going to be seeing the other personal planets doing that as well. So let's take a look at the chart. Okay, so here's a tropical chart from Monday, March 9th, and here is the Saturn. Here's the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, the beginning of Aries. And here is where all of those planets have been moving through Pisces. So like I was talking about, Venus has actually already moved through the world point and made its conjunction with Saturn and Neptune over the weekend. And also the Mercury retrograde was conjunct the Sun over the weekend. So there was already the beginning of this movement of energy that happened over the weekend. So if you felt any shifts or changes in the energy, that's what I believe is happening right now, is that all of these personal planets are going to be moving one stage at a time into this world point and to begin to connect with this area that Saturn and Neptune are conjunct. So Venus, it represents the relationship we have with our values, what we value, and how open we are to receiving and giving that which we value. So you can reflect and think about, what may be coming up in your life, about how empowered do you feel in moving forward to express what it is that you value. Do you feel that you're receiving that which you value? This is an important first question to begin to ask, is do we feel the energy of giving and receiving in our lives balanced with who it is that we prefer to be? Okay. So what we have here is 2 minor grand trines, the first of which is Uranus, Pluto, and Saturn-Neptune. And I had talked about this one already in a previous video, so I'm not going to go into this here. But the other minor grand trine that's happening is with Pluto, Saturn-Neptune, and Black Moon Lilith and the Moon. So if you're not aware, Black Moon Lilith is a mythological character. Lilith was the first wife of Adam that was not seen to be fit for Adam's ability to be in charge, I guess you could say. And she was rejected and was not allowed to be herself in that situation. And so this can represent the parts of ourselves that feel repressed, that feel rejected, that feel that we're not good enough for others or to meet the circumstances that we may feel are required. We can feel guilt or shame around who we prefer to be and who we truly are, and how that may not fit into the societal standard. And what makes this minor grand trine so powerful is because we have this world point energy that is showing us where we're shifting into this new identity. And we have the energy of Pluto, which is bringing great transformation, and parts of ourselves are coming online and new powers being made available we haven't had access to, but it's coming through the lens of the parts of ourselves that have been rejected and repressed and denied. And so it shows how there's a connection between our personal power and the parts of ourselves that we haven't made peace with and we haven't fully integrated. Now, the important thing of understanding how when we work with any kind of denied or repressed emotion is that it does require us to feel it and allow it to move in some way. Rejection and repression and denial holds an energy in place so it can't move. And so a lot of us, because we don't find certain parts of ourselves acceptable, we compress that part of ourselves and we hold it down until it doesn't move anymore, and we kind of just try to ignore it like it's not there. So when this energy starts to move, it wants to vibrate, and that's what can get our attention when certain emotions or certain relational dynamics end up showing us that that energy requires movement. And so I always advise that you just move that emotion, move that energy within your own system as much as possible first, instead of just having a trigger and reacting and blowing up on the people in your life, which may be an appropriate response as well also. But just to know how to responsibly work with shadow energy is to be clear about how it feels and allow it to inform you on how it wants to be expressed. Okay, so that, and so what I found about when we have this harmonious energy like this, these two minor grand trines, this is a lot of flow, a lot of beneficial energy that's moving, that's working to help us to move forward and helping us to align with who we truly are. And anytime that kind of harmonious movement and flow is increased, it can put pressure on the blocks. I kind of see it as like a clog in a garden hose. And if the flow in the hose hits the block and it can't move through, but if that pressure is increased, it will put more pressure on the block in the hose. But it puts more pressure on the block in the hose until eventually that block is released and ejected out of the end of the hose. And so that's kind of what I see the dynamic that's playing out right now. And the way that the block that's being highlighted is through this grand cross between the nodes of fate and Sedna and the moon and Black Moon Lilith. So, okay, so over here we have Sedna and Uranus that are working together closely. And Sedna, if you're not aware, is also a mythological character. She was the daughter of a tribe chief. And in a moment of despair, when the tribe chief felt threatened for his life, he sacrificed and betrayed his daughter. And he cut off her fingers. She was hanging onto the boat, and she fell deep to the bottom of the ocean. And instead of just perishing there, as the myth goes, is that she actually transformed into a spirit that could navigate the depths of the ocean. And she could be seen represented by the ocean life, such as the whales and seals and dolphins. And so what Sedna represents is the part of ourselves that can navigate these depths, that can navigate the deep depths of the emotional unconscious and dredge up and bring up anything that has felt too deep and too compressed and too far down there to access. And what I find about the way that Sedna's energy works is because it's pulling up debris and unprocessed emotional pieces of ourselves from such a deep depth of the water, it needs to move slowly. It's just like when you're going down scuba diving, you need to allow time for the pressure to acclimate as you go deeper. It works the same way when you're pulling up parts of yourself from the depths. Again, this idea of repressed and denied energies are compressed. And so as they're being pulled up and moving towards the surface, they need to go through a gradual decompression process where they can acclimate. And so Sedna is kind of in charge of allowing that to surface, but not so fast that it is overwhelming. And the presence of Uranus here is really showing the power and presence of the dramatic change involved when we bring these pieces of ourselves up. Uranus doesn't just represent change, it represents powerful change. And so when we are pulling up these pieces of ourselves, we have this strong opposition here with both Black Moon Lilith on one side and Sedna on the other. We're dredging up and bringing up these pieces of ourselves that have been compressed. And they can be really challenging and intense to integrate. But it's an important process to understand that it's time for these pieces, it's time for these parts to be seen. It's time for these parts to be felt and integrated into the totality of the self. And that, to me, is how these two energies are working together. This harmonious flow between the outer planets and this great shift and change in our identity and stepping into this new way of being. But it's being held in this gentle, compassionate process of needing to resolve the patterns and programs and denied aspects of the self in order to have access to the new potential options that are available to us as we move forward and create our new identity in the world. Okay, so there was a couple of things that was shared to me about this process that's occurring over the next 5 or 6 weeks. One, because we have all these energies that are still moving through Pisces, and because Pisces is about disillusion, is to give yourself time and space to allow these energies to shift and change and dissolve and reposition and realign. Sometimes we get so caught up in the busyness of our life and everything that we feel that we have to do that we don't intentionally create space and time for rest and relaxation, integration, meditation, stillness, being in nature. This is a very important time to give ourselves as much space as possible to take the pressures off of our old identity and how we've expected it to show up in the world and do everything it's supposed to do, and let ourselves see and feel these pieces that are coming up so that we can allow this dissolution process to happen. And just like I was saying, that when there's this strong emphasis on Pisces and how astrology is about the relational dynamic, and with Pisces about how we relate with our divinity, how we relate with our unconscious, how we relate with spirituality. This is where this is all happening. It's showing us that how we relate with what we consider to be the divine force in the universe, source energy, God consciousness, is the way that we relate with others in our lives and with our jobs and with our own systems of self-worth. And so because there's so much new information that's being added as we're healing and clearing these repressed parts of ourselves that haven't been seen, it's shifting our relationship with understanding how we fit into the cosmos and in the ways that we have a relationship with the all that is, with the Creator, in whatever way we conceive it to be. And so it's important to recognize that as we open up and begin to learn new ways of relating with consciousness and with creation, we're going to watch our relationships in our lives and our relationships to certain aspects of our lives also change, and that's very important. Certain relationships may dissolve and not be there. Other new relationships may come in. The way you feel about your job may change. Your money situation can change. Any compartmentalized aspect of your life and the way that you relate with it potentially will realign itself and have to reposition itself, because it's actually your relationship with creation that is shifting, and those things in your life need to change as they're beginning to align with this new identity when the energy moves into Aries. So that is the first thing I was guided to share. The second thing is that there's going to be 3 stages of the way that this Aries energy will be initiated in each of our own lives, and it was kind of showing me 3 different groups. Group 1 are the people who've been sensitive enough to feel the Saturn-Neptune world point energies this whole time, all the way up until the actual Saturn-Neptune conjunction. There's many people that have already felt the changes they want to make in their life. They understand the new options that they have available, and they've already started taking action and developing a new way of being to make space for that new identity. Okay. Group 2 are people who weren't really feeling the immensity of these change energies until the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and that are now starting to really feel that there's some new options and ideas that are coming online that they can begin to participate in creating a new identity. And so there will be many people who are just now open to the idea that something about their old way of being just doesn't work anymore and doesn't feel right, and they're open to feeling and exploring the new ways that they can begin to act and create and show up in this world in more inspired and empowered ways. And group 3 are people who are so busy and focused on living life the way that they've always lived life that they really aren't feeling the potential for stepping into this new identity yet. And it's understandable because we all like to feel stability and safety and comfort. We like to have a structure in our lives to where we feel supported. But when that gets out of balance, too much comfort, too much structure, too much rigid stability that doesn't change actually doesn't allow new aspects of the soul to be expressed. And that ends up turning into more denial and more unconsciousness about what's being asked of each of us to participate in these changes. They probably still feel that something's changing. They still feel uneasy and unsettled with the effect that we're experiencing our connection on Earth right now, but they don't yet quite feel the changes that they have that they could make or taking action towards that. And what this all hinges on is our understanding of free will. As we know, we all have free will, but we all have a certain ability to access our free will. Not everyone has the same potential of using their free will. And that's because free will can be severely limited, and the bandwidth of choices and options can be held in a rigid place when people are coming from conditioned programs and patterns. And this is why looking at our programs and patterns is so important, because if we just continue to move forward without resolving some of our programs and patterns from childhood, we don't see that we have more new options and that we can make changes that would actually be very expansive and beneficial. We'll just continue to run those programs because people who are operating that way feel they don't have any other choice other than to run those programs. And that's kind of the state that we all engaged as we came into Earth and we began our journey. And as we begin the healing process and we start seeing how we can resolve these patterns and programs, we're resolving the limitations on our potential. We're resolving the beliefs that would hold our potential smaller. And when we resolve those limiting beliefs, we begin to open the bandwidth of options that we didn't know were available. And because you just don't know what you don't know, you can't choose an option you don't have the awareness you have that's available to choose. That's why this healing path has been vital and so important to this shift in consciousness. Because as we heal ourselves and we release those limiting beliefs, we're opening up the field of potential more. So we see options that are available that we didn't see before, and we're able to choose those. And so this is a time where, each person has to be brutally honest with themselves as much as they can and reflect on where they're at in their own healing journey, because that's going to determine the access of how much free will each of us has to choose the options that we would consciously choose to step into this new cycle. Because we're all going through this cycle of change, the collective consciousness is going to change and shift its entire identity, but to each person has their own ability to participate in that and author the next chapter of their journey based on how much free will they have available and how much potential they have to make those new choices. And that's why, again, these energies work together, that this increase of light, increase of the presence of the divine is here, but it's also amplifying and increasing our ability to perceive the limitations and the blocks that we're still holding on and not allowing that divine energy to flow into our own being. Okay? So that's kind of how I see why at this current time these energies are kind of showing us as we move forward the next 5 or 6 weeks, each of these personal planets and our own personal experience is going to begin to have its own relationship with this world point and this new identity. And these new pieces of ourselves are going to start to come online, and we're going to start to feel and engage them in a more palpable and grounded, practical way. But right now, everything's still kind of in flux and dissolving, and that's part of the process. Okay, that's all I have for today. Tomorrow I'm going to take a look at Jupiter going direct, and we're going to talk about how Jupiter going direct at this time relates with all of these energies and take a deeper dive into that, and also do a tarot reading. Okay, again, if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, share the video with anyone who may have use for this kind of information, and I really appreciate connecting with you all, and I'll see you next time.